So, first of all, just welcome to the Disability Confidence training session or Disability Awareness training session. My name is Michelle Holgate. I'm one of the disability advisors here, and this is my colleague, Viv Coombe, who is also a disability advisor here. And before we get into this, I just need to explain that I am a deaf member of staff, and I do have an interpreter at the back of the room. If anybody's got any questions, please could you raise your hand so that I can see who's asking questions. And if I'm looking at the interpreter instead of you, please don't be offended. It just means that I can pick up all the information as accurately as possible and answer your queries as best as possible as well. Okay. So the objectives of this session really is to provide an understanding of our legal obligations in relation to students with disability. And also to provide an understanding of the different terms of disability. And we're hoping to raise a little bit more awareness of the issues and barriers that students can face in higher education and what the university is doing to address those issues, and to introduce some best practices. There will be time afterwards for any questions, so please do drop them down and ask away at the end.
Michelle, sorry, before you start, can I just ask people to introduce themselves and tell us what their role is, because I think we've got quite a mix in the room.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if you don't have...
I'm Lorraine Dyson, Facilities Manager in HLS, so I deal with you guys for students with for evacuation plans and sick leave.
And I'm Emma Coombe, Lorraine's my line manager, so I'm an admin assistant and receptionist in Sinclair.
I'm Karen Harris. I'm everything you post now. And I'm a programme administrator in Health and Life Sciences, and I'm also one of the first aiders, so disability awareness is big for me. I'm also a disabled member of staff.
I'm Olivia Afonso. I'm a research fellow in psychology department. I have some teaching commitments too.
I'm Matt Hayes, I'm the Student Welfare Advisor for Wellbeing.
Oh, hi, yes. What are you doing here?
I'm Mel Williamson. I'm one of the student support coordinators for the faculty based here and Sweden.
I'm Katie, I'm a lecturer in sport and exercise science.
I'm Sarah, lecturer in sports and exercise science.
I'm Kerry. I started yesterday in working with Viv and Michelle.
I'm Deborah Pearce, a programme lead for biology and environment, and with always on my mind how we deal with disability and field work.
Right.
So physical disability and field work.
I mean, on the back of that, has anybody else got any specific things that they were hoping to get out of this session?
I suppose it's little top tips on how to make the course more accessible. So we also have a lot of practical elements in our course, but it's also just being aware of even where people sit, where we stand, present, what's on your presentations, etc. Just some little tips really.
And possibly awareness of non-visual disability, whether that's also mental health.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. My subject area, we tend to have quite a few with unseen disabilities. So that would be useful.
Yeah.
And I have an idea for that as well.
Okay. I think, we've only got, just short of an hour. This is going to be quite general, though I hope we have got a practical exercise when we want you to think about the sorts of reasonable adjustments that you could make. So hopefully during that discussion we can touch on some of the things that you've raised. Okay, but and there may be, I think what we can do is think about resources that we could email out to you to look in more detail at the areas that you've particularly identified. Okay. Oh right, it's me again. Right, so you've got your piece of paper. Hopefully you've all come well equipped with a pen. And what I want you to do give you 30 seconds, and I want you to write your name down as many times as possible in 30 seconds. That's first and last name. Okay. You're all right there. Anyone got a spare pen?
Oh, there's one just there.
That's one there.
Oh, there we are. Right, so first and last name as many times as possible in 30 seconds starting now.
Does it have to be me? Legible. I can't do legible. It's more like my signature.
Right, now I want you to do the same with your non-dominant hand. And 30 seconds. It is 30 seconds.
Oh, I know. Oh, this is so nice. Are we going?
Yeah, non-dominant hand.
I can't make the pen work.
I know.
My nails are too long.
Excuses.
Yeah.
Right, there.
2.
How was that? The second time.
That's true.
How did you find that, writing with your non-dominant hand?
Difficult. Hard.
Yeah, really hard.
Yeah, so what, did it require more concentration, more effort? Okay, so, I mean, that's just to give you an idea of what it might be like if you're struggling with a physical disability, which might affect your mobility. Okay, so bear that in mind, the extra effort that you're having to bring to, quite what should be a relatively easy, activity. Right, now what I want you to do, you're going to have 30 seconds again, and I want you to write your name with the letters backwards. So only your first name this time, and this is how I want it, so with the letters back to front. Okay, so if you can all do that, starting now, and see how many times you can do it.
Just our first name.
Yeah, just your first name.
Mine's quite easy.
But I want the letters reversed.
Oh, hang on.
So the order's the same, but the letters are reversed.
You'd be writing yours backwards.
Oh, some of you will get.
Oh no, I can't do it.
At least I've got an O in my name.
Oh, I've got M and A, which makes it quite easy. 3 of my letters are the same.
So how was that?
Because I did it.
Yeah.
You just write your name.
I'm going to get, the idea is, if somebody with dyslexia or another specific learning difficulty, they might have difficulties akin to that, where you're having to really concentrate and focus on what you're attempting to do. Okay, over to Michelle.
Now just to introduce you a little bit to the legalities when it comes to supporting students with disabilities. The Equality Act was brought in 2010, and it brought together 9 different strands or different cohorts of people to promote equality. One of those strands is disability. So that means that the university has a legal obligation to anticipate and proactively provide support to students with disabilities to ensure inclusion in all areas of student life. So we're not just talking about academic life, we're talking about halls of residences, we're talking about community life, all of those kind of things that are associated with university life. Okay, so defining a disability can either be done in relation to a physical, mental or medical condition that has a substantial impact and a long-term impact on the ability to carry out daily activities. So a short-term condition wouldn't necessarily fall under a disability category. So if a student has broken their arm and they're likely to recuperate in 6 weeks' time, then that is not classed as a disability as such. Substantial means more than minor. or trivial. So it can mean a student might take longer to get from one location to the next. It can mean that they may have difficulties in writing for prolonged periods of time or at speed. And long term generally means 12 months or longer. Okay. This is the basic definition of disability in accordance with the Equality Act, but it's not always that clear cut. There are some grey areas as well. And if you
Sorry, Michelle, I was going to say, generally people have to meet this criteria and provide evidence in order to register with our service.
Okay. There are two different types of discrimination. One is direct discrimination, which is fairly obvious. A person is discriminating against another person because of the disability they're thought to have. Indirect discrimination is more difficult to identify because it's embedded in a practice or a policy which applies to everybody else but has the ability to disadvantage a student.
I mean, field trips actually could be, depending on how they're set up, potentially sort of indirect discrimination, if you're not making adjustments for people to access it.
Okay. There are different categories of disability. To say one category can overlap into another, or you can have two categories brought together, so it's not just a standalone category. So you get your physical disability, where a student may need to use a wheelchair, they may have hypermobility syndrome, arthritis, fibromyalgia, anything that's considered long-term and substantial. Hidden disabilities, we touched on that earlier on, and that can include a whole range of disability. And obviously the list is not exhaustive, but it can include things like Crohn's disease, epilepsy, chronic fatigue, even severe IBS, severe asthma, diabetes, again, anything that's long-term and substantial. Sensory impairment, that can include visual impairment, the whole spectrum of visual impairment and the whole spectrum of hearing impairment as well. It can also include auditory processing disorders. Now, auditory processing disorder is not a hearing impairment as such. It is slightly different. It's where the communication between the ear and sound and the brain is not connecting. So even though a student can hear, they may not be able to recognise specific sounds. So those are the three first ones. Then we've got mental health. Again, that can vary across many conditions, with bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, long-term anxiety rather than short-term anxiety. So we're not talking about anxiety that's associated with getting ready for exams, where you get a little bit worked up the night before. We're talking about long-term anxiety. Autism, eating disorders, and that can include the whole range of eating disorders, which include anorexia, bulimia. And then finally we have learning difficulties, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADD, ADHD, dyscalculia. Okay.
And we certainly, I think, increasingly we're seeing people with more than one condition and with increasingly complex needs, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of. And just to go back to the anxiety, I think that's quite a difficult area for us, because there is everyone experiences anxiety, but it's a real dilemma for our service about whether people actually meet the requirements according to the disability legislation and should be registered with our service, and those that perhaps do need support but don't fit that definition, and again just increasing numbers year on year. So that's quite a dilemma.
Just ask, if we're talking about the law here, not all students declare. I've been walking back from the field where somebody says to me, oh, I often just black out. And I thought, I wish I'd known that. I would just taken you to the edge of a cliff or whatever.
It is a real challenge. Some students will declare, then they won't provide medical evidence. So, you know, we're limited in what we can do with regard to particularly academic adjustments. Though, of course, once somebody's declared, then the university as a whole is deemed to know. So there's also an issue around communication between different departments. And I think the other thing is there's this anticipatory duty that the university has. So and this is the, you know, part of the driver behind sort of inclusive teaching practices. You know, we should be making things as inclusive as possible, regardless of who we know to you know, as individuals with a disability, because there'll be staff, there'll be visitors, there'll be students themselves with a disability that we're not aware of. But, right, what I'm going to do is just get you into 3 groups, and if I do, you 3 sit together, you 3, and perhaps you 4 at the back, and then this group, if you can think about what the needs of a student with multiple sclerosis might be, and I have got, I don't know how familiar you'd be with some of these conditions. This group can think about people with anxiety. And then the final group, it's people with hearing loss. So there's just some symptoms. I've given you a list of symptoms that the person might or might not experience.
Well, that's where a mentor helps as well. You
I
can see a
imagine that
mentor
one of the
every
other
week
things
to
that's
help.
quite anxiety driven as well as the
mentor
knowing about their anxiety as well, and that being a huge block. And that's why some students don't declare their anxiety to staff, because they don't want people to know, even though they obviously themselves need the support and help them.
It'd be useful.
Okay, hopefully you've got you know, enough points to sort of start a bit of a discussion really. Just to pick up, I think it was Mel, you said that one size won't fit all, and I think that's key with disability. I think people can have, you know, the same diagnosis, but the condition can present very differently in different people. And the other major factor I think that comes into play is, you know, the individual themselves, depending on their personality, their past experience, they will also deal with their disability in a range of different ways. You know, mental health is sort of a classic example. You know, I've worked with students who are very clear about what they need to do well. You know, they know what symptoms to look for, they know what action to take. You know, if they feel they're going to hit a crisis, and what they need to do to remain well on an ongoing basis. They'll take their medication if that's appropriate, and you know, whatever. And then you work with students who are incredibly chaotic, you know, and they'll self-medicate with drugs, alcohol, they won't take medication, often for good reasons. You know, I work with a lot of young men, they're given medication, strong medication, that can really knock you off and cause things like impotence. You know, I mean, you know, and that's the choice they have to make. So it's really difficult, and it's not about people being bad, or it's just, we're all different, you know, but you always need to take that into account as well. So let's first start with the person with multiple sclerosis. What sort of things did you come up with as ideas for reasonable adjustments?
A mentor, for starters, from Wellbeing, to help organise themselves. Sorry, did you know?
No, you don't.
Okay. Ground floor accommodation, possibly adapted accommodation as well, depending on their mobility. An evacuation plan
Yeah.
for them, a non-academic assistant to help in case there's problems with pain, writing or vision issues, accessible lecture rooms to make sure, that's why we haven't mentioned Gibbs is not accessible, especially if you want the third floor. And informing people like the academic advisor, lecturers, student support coordinator, programme admin, so that they're aware and can help. And probably extra exam provisions as well, in case it's a bad day. If it's a good day, great.
Yeah.
If it's a bad day, they might need extra
Breaks
time.
or something, or extra time,
So.
Okay, right, so quite a comprehensive list there. I mean, the physical access, it's a nightmare. And Irene Moore, our colleague, deals with most of that, doesn't she? And even in the new buildings, there are lots of issues. And it's not just physical access. I think other groups of students have difficulty with accessing the buildings.
I was just going to mention with JHB, when we had an autism
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Overstimulant, too much.
Yeah, people on the autistic spectrum can be hypersensitive to light, sound, which is another issue, and touch. And the lights when the sun shines. Have you been in the JHB building where it's all red? And this chap had come, he has autism and came to do a training session. He had to leave. He just couldn't cope with the lights and
You thought there were gaps in the floor because the lights hit the carpet.
So it's incredibly stressful, and of course they're the sort of things, unless you've experienced it, it's hard to appreciate just how stressful and tiring that kind of thing can be. And a lot of people, they won't necessarily have to leave the building, but it will be stressful, and people can go home at the end of the day feeling incredibly exhausted, just having to cope with the sensory overload.
And trying to get out of the building as well.
With
an escape, a direct route, whereas in like the library, for instance, you can't walk all the way through on a certain floor.
I mean, obviously where we know that there are people with mobility issues, and there might be, issues around evacuation. Our colleague Irene, she tends to do the PEEPs, the personal evacuation plans, and we do look at, what rooms for lectures people are in, but as you can imagine with the building works and things, it's been an absolute nightmare.
And just to add to that, when we have deaf students, it can become quite tricky because of the acoustics in the room. The acoustics in the room are not always ideal for deaf students. Deaf students who have cochlear implants may find the sound in this room really difficult to contend with, so they have to put so much energy into lip reading, sitting at the front of the room, so there's a lot more of themselves going into the lectures than the average student. And if we've got students who use sign language interpreters, for instance, we take this room as an example. I've got sign language interpreters standing in front of the window, which makes it very difficult for me to see her because of the shadows behind. So it really is quite difficult, but because the PowerPoint is here, I have no alternative but to stand here. And the interpreters have no alternative but to stand there, so that just makes it extra difficult. So thinking about presentation for deaf students, if they were to conduct this presentation and they were being assessed, and they have an interpreter at the back of the room, that extra concentration on going on them and delivering the presentation can make it really, really stressful, especially if it's being assessed. So that's when things can go horribly wrong. And there are limited amounts of rooms that have loop systems. Loop systems are not a fix-all solution. Loop systems are only suitable for deaf students who wear hearing aids and they have a T-set setting on their hearing aids. If they don't wear hearing aids and they don't have a T setting on there, they cannot access the loop system. But there are other ways of dealing with that, in which case, as you pointed out earlier on, students may use a rotary pen, in which case I will give the module leader a microphone and that will send the sound wirelessly over to the student, but it isn't always 100% effective because again it depends on the acoustics in the room.
I think the other thing about that as well, we had a student who was having remote captioning. So she would sit in the lecture with her laptop, the lecturer would have the mic, and then it would be relayed to somebody sat in London who would type it up, you know, as it was being spoken, and then it would appear on the laptop, which was great. But there were real issues, and of course some lecturers will stand and just speak. Others will be walking across the room or, you know, moving around, and of course that interferes with, you know, the communication, either both visually and, you know, with what the person's able to hear as well.
Can I ask, so at what point do you get involved with like new students? Do you only see them at induction, or do you meet them? What's the process before they start?
Okay, we start early as possible. So we usually get copies of UCAS forms or a list from the admissions office around about May time. So each advisor will contact a specific group of students, but all of them will be contacted during the summer holidays. We try to establish their support requirement as early as possible because we need to be anticipatory and proactive. So that's what we do throughout the summer holiday. But communication is a two-way thing, and we rely on students engaging with us just as much as we engage with them.
I'm just thinking about room bookings because we encourage module leaders to let us know if they've got anyone on their course that has particular requirements, and we would put that into the room booking system. But if you don't know, and
we won't know until
you won't know, then you have to kind of play catch up when they start to say, oh, actually, we need to change all these rooms because.
And it is amazing sometimes that some students with very complex needs, as someone mentioned, like a visual impairment, you know, where you want to get equipment set up, that sort of thing. And they'll rock up, you know, sort of a week before, and but I mean that, you know, but other people we do have contact with over the summer, and I know Irene will contact room bookings and things directly. And
I do actually have somebody coming in that's, in his words, severely visually impaired, didn't declare it on his application.
Yeah, no. And people don't declare for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one of the main groups who we find don't declare at the point of application are people with mental health issues, and I think, you know, there are understandable reasons for that. The stigma, I think people are often looking for a new start, you know, they come hoping things are going to be different, and it's not until they start hitting deadlines, the end of the semester's looming, and then they'll get a crisis, and then we'll have, you know, a lot of new disclosures.
And I think one of the relevant points here, because we've got academic start, is some students can feel an overwhelming fear of making a disclosure because they think it will affect the chances of them being accepted within the university as a student, or they will be singled out compared to their peers. So we kind of have to work with students to explain reasonable judgment and the whole leveling the playing field idea.
And I think that's particularly true, isn't it, where it's a professional qualification, you know, like nursing, OT, you know, anything like that, where there's the fitness to practice issue. And I think the other thing for staff to stress is our service is confidential, and we certainly, you know, if they're getting a reference or anything from the university, it's not something that would go on any reference, you know, the fact that they've had support through the disability services. So that's something we always try and stress, and that we'll take our leave from them really, as long as there's, I mean, obviously if there's a risk, then, you know, we would break confidentiality if need be, but otherwise, yeah, it's, and you mentioned accommodation. We liaise closely with accommodation, and I must say the hall staff are excellent, you know, we often have I've had staff knocking on people's doors to try and make sure they get to their exam and things, and, you know, but they are excellent. So, was there anything else? So, and exam concessions. I mean, that, oh, and just to say, the mentoring. students, particularly with mental health issues, some with chronic sort of physical disabilities as well, they may well be eligible for mentoring. The university will only fund 6 sessions of mentoring, and the expectation is that the student will apply for the disabled student allowance, and then they will fund ongoing mentoring throughout the person's degree. And that, I mean, particularly for students on the autistic spectrum, I mean, it's invaluable, really.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What is the mentoring, what actually happens in those mentoring
So
sessions?
basically, we employ mentors, so they're trained mentors, they're not students. Some universities use, students, but these are people employed specifically to mentor students, so they've got, a degree, a professional qualification, and it's quite practical in that it will often look at planning the students' studies, making sure they can access all the systems, which can be a real challenge in the first few years. So prioritising and looking at as managing, not in a therapy, it's not therapeutic, but looking at how that person can manage their condition alongside their studies. So well-being, really,
I actually had a mentor here, and I'm quite open. That's me. So if you want to know anything about it or what the experience is like, by all means.
But would you say it was positive?
Oh God, yes. Yeah. I mean, I was contending with so many different things, as you know, but and it really helped. And in fact, I saw my old mentor a few weeks ago here at another training session, and she remembered me, which was lovely. So.
Yeah, and like Billy was saying, they're highly experienced. They've
They
been
are.
all sorts. They've been maybe done psychotherapy in their previous.
Are counsellors, but that's not what they're employed for.
Yeah.
Okay, anxiety. Some of the things that you
can do.
Okay. We talked about longer term anxiety and how that affects students rather, because I know it's a bit of a challenge around short term and as you said, everyone experiences anxiety at some point in their lives. So we looked at extensions to coursework, that kind of stuff, because obviously the symptoms can come up at any time. So we looked at that. We looked at mentoring as well as an option for students with this. We considered separate spaces for exams, because obviously exam processes can be quite anxiety evoking. We considered potential adjustments that could be considered in the lecture room. So if a student was concerned about the specific anxieties that Mel was talking about, was a student being the last or the first in the room and finding space that and talking to them about that and working with that. We talked about group work, about how if a student has an anxiety around speaking in public, considering how the group work could be accessible for the student regarding, so perhaps smaller groups rather than big groups in the initial kind of phases. And things like that, really.
You had one example, because
because in one of my models, the students have to make a presentation individually, and I have last year I had 6 students in that model. So if one of them is not presenting for no reason, you are singling out that person. So it's very clear. It's like, okay, I can make adjustments. How can I do it without the focus being, and this person is not presenting for some reason?
it's really difficult, and it's something that crops up often. Alternative assessment to presentations, and it's something we always try and encourage students to develop their skills when it comes to presenting, because it's such a crucial skill. Whatever you do, being able to stand up in front of people, whether it's an interview, it's important. So we wouldn't look at an alternative assessment as a first resort, but we do make that recommendation sometimes, and it is difficult, and it's a conversation worth having with the student, particularly where it's a small group, and to say, how, and talk through with them what the issues are, that you're concerned they're going to be singled out. How do they feel about that? You know, some students won't mind, but others, you know, would find that even worse. And I do think, you know, I think people get anxious about talking to students about their disability, but the students are the people who are expert in their own condition. So I think it's always worth having that conversation and sort of, if you can, take the lead from them. And most people are happy to talk about it. Not always. I rang a young man this morning who's on the autistic spectrum, very anxious, and he didn't want to explain to me what had been going on, so he passed me on to his dad, you know, and so people will usually say if they're going to have difficulties around something like that, but I would talk with the student. But it is difficult. I mean, and it's, if we've seen the student and academics are aware before the start of the module, I think it's probably easier, because then you can think. It's when we have to inform academics partway through a module that I think, you know, that can be particularly difficult.
So my example was an academic advisee, and I knew her issue, but she took a while to kind of come out exactly the extent of it, and it wasn't until she had to do an individual presentation the day before it got too much, and that's the module leader had to get involved in terms of presentations. But for them, obviously, it was quite last minute to change.
Yes, and it's difficult then, you know. And what we could do then is, you know, support the student to apply for mitigating circumstances.
What if you get a student who says they suffer with anxiety, but they haven't applied through the normal processes, and they come in and are absolutely panicking about doing a presentation? So that's when we always get a bit, as academics, we get a bit worried because of the whole issue now of people doing things that we don't want them to do. Well, you know what I mean? Like with suicide, I'd say.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, that's.
But you, I mean, you can always
tough calls to make sometimes.
Yeah.
And I know we should just send them to the people, to the counsellors, but it's kind of a really grey area.
Yeah, it is. I think, I mean, it is difficult because, of course, if people have, you know, they're deemed to have declared, then we should be making the adjustments. But I think what we do is say that, you know, you need to get this set up in advance and refer them to the disability team rather than counselling.
Yeah.
Because we're the ones that can put in place the reasonable adjustments, and we can support them if necessary, again, with the MIT circs and things.
And if they are, I find a lot of students find the actual approaching Buckley is that big step. Sometimes I'm a good halfway house.
Yeah.
And then I've actually taken a student to Buckley, and they found it less daunting. Because in itself, it's like I'm walking in and I'm being thought of I'm special and different just by walking into that building.
So you said so that we can put in place a reasonable adjustment. So will you always help with reasonable adjustment?
Yeah, we're
Every
always.
year we have students who we're not sure whether they're safe to take out in the field, because often they suffer from, it might be multiple sclerosis, it might be, often it's extreme tiredness or muscular things. And staff, sadly, academic staff feel overwhelmed all the time with our workload. And then we've got X, Y and Z coming on top of it where we're barely coping.
Yeah.
And that's where it worries me, all this, and that
I mean, a recent example,
what can be put in place and how.
I was working with a student, he's got mental health condition, diagnosis of schizophrenia, and I mean, he's well maintained on medication, but understandably staff were anxious about going to Spain, and what we did was arrange for a support worker to go with him. And it wasn't, you know, we were quite confident. I mean, he'd been stable for several years on deco injections, so there was no risk of him missing doses of medication. But what we were concerned about was the impact he might have on the other group if he were late getting up because his medication makes him very drowsy. So practical things like that. And that worked really well. And it all went off, you know, without a problem. So it's definitely worth coming back to us, because we do need to put that support in place.
And just to supplement that, I had a similar student who was doing a similar field trip abroad. One of the reasonable adjustments that the department were able to put in place was, rather than the student having to go to Spain, they were able to identify a location in this country, not too far away from home, so they could achieve the same outcome as their peers. And of course it's about thinking about different
And I
options.
think somebody else had their own room rather than share a room, which for them was just a bit of space. So it does.
So is that, how common would it be now for somebody to be able to accompany somebody on the field trip? Because that's indeed what staff often worry about, is because we had that a couple of years ago. I took an MSc student out who really wanted to come. He was in a wheelchair and he had some kind of muscular disease, I can't remember what it was. And we really put everything in place for him to come, just us as a team. And once we got out there, he was just too cold. It was a particularly cold day, and we just had to call it to an end for everybody, because he had to be taken home really. And so staff there, I encouraged us to do that, because we'd spoken to the student, as you say, you know, and he really thought he'd be okay, and identified there was paths he could stay on, even if other students had time to climb down areas. And I thought it was going to work really well, but it didn't.
Yeah, and sadly sometimes things don't work as we'd
But had I had a
like.
support worker there who could have taken him
Back,
perhaps somewhere
wasn't it?
or back or to a cafe or something, then it would have
So it's
worked.
definitely, I mean, I've certainly, I think it's about 3 students where we've put that in place that I've worked with. So it's certainly worth having a conversation.
Especially where the field trips are compulsory.
Yes,
Yes, they are, even having problems with surveys and licensing.
Okay, just brief, sorry, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
The hearing loss, what issues did you come up with that?
Well, as solutions or reasonable adjustments, certainly making sure lots of things are invited, so that we've got like instructions for using equipment, for example, in sports, to make sure that they're really adequate. We did think of hearing loops, etc., but I've heard that many of them don't work.
Yeah.
And we don't always know where there is hearing loops. And I don't know that our room booking system, for me it should be automatically go straight from you to room bookings. But it clearly doesn't, because I've had many people in 302 in a wheelchair and it's impossible to get to. And the same student several years on the trot put in that room, and every time was having to change room. What else do we know? We thought that our lamps and that were equipped, but we're naive in knowing how well it works.
So again, you can always talk with one of the disability advisors if you've got any queries about that.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing talking about lab work is if a student who has a hearing impairment is looking at the microscope, they cannot hear the information at the same time. So that's when you need to maybe think about the timing of the information that you deliver to the student. So it's just those kind of things. And one of the things that are really common for lecturers to use are audio-visual material, so videos, clippings from YouTube and so on. Please make sure that they're all subtitled, because these are the one areas where students can really miss out on, and it's a very simple thing to do. If subtitles is not available, perhaps because you've recorded it at home, then do get in contact with us, because we can look at alternatives such as transcripts and so on. Thank you.
I mean, our lecture capture is something we'd love to see across the board. It would save so many hassles. Our initial reaction when someone said, "Can we record you?" was no, but we thought, no, we've got to, practice what we preach. So it's difficult.
Just a quick question. It may vary, I know, by person to person, but if someone who's hearing impaired, is how long they can, and they lip read, how long can they lip read before they need a break? Is there any information about that, so we can plan breaks?
Okay, as a general rule of the thumb, it's every 20 minutes.
Okay, right.
And if you're using interpreters as well, and you're expecting to use interpreters for a 2-hour lecture, they will need to have a co-worker to take it in turn so that they can have a break also. But as a general rule of the thumb, we recommend a break every 20 minutes for the students to rest I'm going to continue with the lecture.
I'm really sorry, we've run out of time. They're sort of in the door. Yeah, hopefully you found it helpful.